So I'd just like to welcome everyone to this morning. It's not morning. Today's MGA market briefing. I'm very happy to have with us Scrub AI, who are going to deliver us a session on data privacy and AI. But before we move into the main event, I've got a bit of housekeeping to do. So, as usual, apologies for people that have listened to this previously. It doesn't change, I'm afraid. So it's the same information, but just so that in case anyone hasn't had the pleasure of listening to it, I'll run it through again. So polite to ask, please, if you can keep microphones and cameras off, because as I usually say, we'd really like to stay with you for the duration. So if we can minimise any technical issues, that would be much appreciated. Also, ironically, with the name of the session that we're doing today, could I ask that if anyone has activated any AI note-taking tools, that they deactivate them, because we don't have everyone's permission, which we may well learn more about when we get into the session. But yeah, so if you don't deactivate them, unfortunately, I'll have to step in and I will eject them from the meeting. So that be appreciated if you have started any, you could stop them at this point. Also, just to remind you that our sessions are accredited by the CII for CPD purposes. So if this meets with your training needs, you can add it onto your CPD log. And as I always mention, it is being recorded. I think Zoom very helpfully has told us all that, but just to let you know as well. The good news about that is that there will be a recording available afterwards, and I will share the link with you. So if you want to share that with colleagues or to review the content, it will be available for you with a copy of the slides. So that leaves me really just to introduce briefly our presenters and hand over. So from Scrub AI today, we have Nicola, Alex and Ion, who will do a far better introduction than that of themselves. And yes, the subject today is data privacy and AI. So I will hand over to Scrub AI.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Alison. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having us, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Nicola. I'm one of the co-founders and COO at Scrub. My background is insurance. I used to be a property underwriter for a Lloyd's syndicate before leaving about 5 years ago to start Scrub. So what do we do at Scrub? We've built a data cleaning platform which relies on AI to clean, validate and transform data so that it can be automatically ingested into any downstream platform. So, for example, you can drop a messy SOV into the platform and instantly clean it up for your CAP modeling output format or your pricing format that you need. Or you could drag and drop a bordereau into the platform and instantly clean it up into V5.2 or transform it into the format you need for your binder management system or your internal data warehouse. We wanted to give this presentation today because we talked to a lot of CAP modelling teams in the market, a lot of underwriters and a lot of ops teams. And there's real excitement about AI and what it can do and where it can practically add value. But at the same time, there's real disparity and a real grey area in terms of how it could and should be used at work. So, for example, what is your company's risk appetite when it comes to AI being used at work? What's in line with your data privacy policies? Are you even allowed to use ChatGPT at work? If yes or no, then why or why not? So we put this presentation together to explain how different AI tools and different vendors use and store your data, and how this impacts how risky they might be in a given scenario. So I'm going to introduce you to Alex and Ion now. Alex is a very experienced full stack developer. He's one of my fellow co-founders at Scrub and also our CEO. And Ion has a master's in engineering science from Oxford, a master's in artificial intelligence from Imperial, and he is one of our very talented machine learning engineers. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Alex.
Thanks a lot, Nicola. So yeah, this is the very fun part of the presentation that I get to do, which is a little bit of doom and gloom, let's say, potentially to set the scene and talk about how risky or not these AI models may be, before I hand over to Ian a little bit later in the presentation when he gets to talk about a little bit more fun things, which is how to practically sort of mitigate and minimize these risks. So when we think about how risky AI models are, or the use of AI is, we often think about what am I protecting myself against? How might my data be exposed? And how do I protect my data? So what's my protecting me against? Typically trying to make sure that my data doesn't get into the wrong hands. That would often look like competitors or hackers or bad actors. And often as a result of that, you could have some, financial and or reputational damage, which often comes from the regulators and the public. So if people are made aware that you've, managed to lose some of your client data or lose some of your own intellectual property, that doesn't look good from a reputational perspective, and often it comes with associated fines. So we want to avoid all of these things. Secondly, how might my data be exposed? So at first, only I have my data, which is good. But obviously, you don't typically do everything yourself in a business. You typically, use some other service providers, some consultants, whatever it may be, in order to get the job done. A lot of you won't be training your own models. Maybe some of you will. So at some point, you will end up sending your data somewhere. So when you have it yourself, you need to make sure all the sort of classical data hygiene guidelines are followed, good passwords and secure and all that stuff, which Ian will sort of talk about a little bit later. But eventually, when it does get to the provider that you use, it's very possible that from there it goes to another third party. So I would hazard a guess that most of you and your companies use one of the big three cloud providers like Azure, AWS, or Google Cloud. You may use APIs like OpenAI or Anthropic, or even things like geocoding services. Or the providers that you send your data to may also use them themselves. And so you can see that as the data gets further and further away from you, the picture gets murkier and murkier. It's harder to keep track of it. So that's why it's important to take precautions as early as possible, and to make sure that you're only working with people that you really trust. And so once it does get shared, there's three main ways that it can be exposed. So it can be stolen, whether that's physically stolen, social engineering, weak passwords, weak security, whatever it may be, it can be stolen. It can be sent by me, either sort of knowingly or perhaps unknowingly. You may use an interface such as ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot or GitHub Copilot or Anthropic, Claude, you name it. You may use one of these services, Gemini from Google, and you may inadvertently use your personal account, hopefully not. You may use the company account to access it, and you or your company may have set up default settings of how that data is shared with them. That may mean that it's with them for 30 days or longer. And once your data's gone, it is very hard, if not impossible, to get it back. And finally, it may be inferred. So if someone does get hold of your data, they do train a model on that data, someone then who got access to that model could potentially reverse engineer and sort of extract the training data from that model. And then one sort of final note before I hand over to Ian and we get into some of the fun stuff. Not all data carries the same exposure potential. So Nicola talked at the start about your risk appetite. Your general risk appetite may be X, but your risk appetite for different types of data may be ABC, maybe slightly different. So the riskiest and most sensitive data is personal data, or personally identifiable information, PII, as a lot of people call it. That is names, email addresses, claims histories, financial histories, all that kind of stuff. Commercially sensitive data is the next sort of tier of data, which is things like insured values, P&L for yourself or for your clients for the last few years, portfolio breakdowns, so on and so forth. And then more generic data at the bottom, so construction type, occupancy type, general postcode. And so depending on the type of data, your risk profile may change. And so without further ado, the doom and gloom is over. I'm going to pass over to Ian, and he's going to talk about how I protect my data.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, all of this is a bit stressful, I think, because there are real risks about what can happen if my data falls into the wrong hands. But actually, thankfully, we now get to the optimistic part because there are actual ways to protect very reliably our data. So let's see what these ways are. So first of all, when we were mentioning how someone might get a hold of my data, and crucially how the wrong person might get a hold of our data, we first talked about our data being stolen. So how can I avoid my data being stolen? And that is by storing them securely. Now, beware that needs to apply to me, because obviously I have my data, but to whoever else has my data as well, because I might have given it to a direct provider. So I need to make sure that whoever has my data is in possession of my data, make sure to store them securely. And how to do this is there's various technical ways in which to do this. I'm not going to go too deep into them, but first of all, it's good practice to use encrypted storage. It's also very important to make sure that the data are stored in secured access controlled environments, such as virtual private clouds, VPCs, as we call them. And finally, in order not to go into all the technical details, which are quite a lot, we need to make sure that we and also other people who are in possession of our data follow industry standards, such as ISO 27001, which is the international standard for information security management systems, to ensure that the data are stored securely. All right. So moving on to the second way in which someone might get a hold of our data, and that is by us or whoever else has our data sending them. So maybe I will send my data by accident, or maybe someone else will send it. And as we said, a common way when this happens is when I'm using APIs. So when I use, let's say, OpenAI's ChatGPT API and send my data there in order to get some value out of it. It's okay to use APIs, of course. I mean, a lot of the time, those powerful LLMs are so capable that you might think that it's in your best interest, and it might indeed be in your best interest to use them. And of course, that's great, because that's why technology is for. But we need to make sure that we manage the risk when sending our data and when using such APIs. So first of all, why is it risky to send my data via an API? Well, of course, first of all, if I send it to the wrong person, that's already like damage done. But also, if I send it to someone like OpenAI, the things that the data, by the time I send them there, they exit my contractual boundaries, and they can be handled based on the terms and conditions of the third party to which I've sent my data. So I sort of lose control of my data. So that's why I need to be careful. And how am I going to be careful? How can I mitigate the risk? Well, best way, first of all, again, avoid using APIs altogether. But of course, sometimes you might want to use them, and that's fair enough. Secondly, if I am going to use an API, it's good to just look at the terms and conditions to make sure that they're tight enough that my data will be protected when I send them. And crucially, it's good to look for a no data retention policy. So making sure that the third party to which I send my data to will not keep my data, and they will only be there ephemerally. And obviously, if you have multiple different options about what API to use, you just gotta compare the terms and conditions between, let's say, OpenAI and Anthropic, and so on. Okay, so we talked about the first way in which I can lose my data, and that is by someone stealing it. We talked about protecting against the second way, which is sending it to the wrong person or not mitigating risk when sending my data. Now moving on to the third way, which is controlling the risk when sharing trained models. So what does that mean, first of all? Sometimes you or your solution provider may be motivated to train a model on your data in order to make it perform some task on your data, to power a solution on your data, to clean your data, whatever it is that you might be looking for. Now, and then this trained model, maybe your solution provider, maybe you decide that it's actually very good in, let's say, whatever it does, let's say clean your data, and you might want to sell it to get some profit out of it. So that might be a reason why there might be motivation for someone to share a model that has been trained on your data, and now we can look at what dangers this includes and how to protect against them. So first of all, if someone sees a model trained on my data, can they extract my data? Can they reconstruct my data from that model? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on various factors. But I think one of the most important ones is whether the model is generative or not. There has been a lot of case studies that have shown that generative models can be tricked into spitting out the data that they were trained on. Because if they're prompted carefully, maybe they will just start reproducing, talking, like saying the things that they were trained on. So as a rule of thumb, sharing generative models trained on my data is not a good idea. Now, there's also another aspect. If the model is not generative, and it has a constrained output, constricted output, let's say, for example, that it's a classification model. It just classifies the data as, I don't know, SOVs versus some other insurance kind of data. I don't know, just giving an example of what a classification model might be rather than a generative model. Well, for these models, we need to realize if the access that we're granting when sharing those models is what we call black box access or white box access. Black box access, and I'm not going to go too deep into that, is when whoever has access to the model can only see what goes in and what goes out. And that is quite safe for non-generative models. Whereas white box access, when they can see the weights, the probabilities, the middle layers of the model, which is a bit more technical, usually something that developers might be interested in, is a bit more unsafe. So overall, zooming out, sharing models trained on your data can sometimes be unsafe, otherwise can be secure if done in the right way. And we spoke about the different ways to go about it. Right, so now that we've talked about how do we protect against the dangers, how do we pick a provider that we can trust to follow the guidelines that we spoke about and protect us or protect our data from falling into their own hands? So first of all, a question that we might want to ask ourselves is, who do I trust in terms of, is it better to trust a direct solution provider? So that might be Scrub. That would be someone that my company has a direct contract with, as opposed to a general purpose provider, such as, let's say, ChatGPT, OpenAI, Google, these big tech companies. So first of all, the key difference, as I said, is that a direct solution provider is bound by a contract that I have drafted and that I control, as opposed to the general purpose provider who can handle my data based on their own terms and conditions. So in that sense, it makes more sense to trust a direct solution provider. Furthermore, a direct solution provider can be held more accountable for the way they store and process my data and whether they do it according to the terms of our contract. Whereas for a general purpose provider, they can only be held accountable, again, based on the terms and conditions that they set and not against whatever I want them to do with my data. And finally, it might be important to note that a direct solution provider who is selling their solution to me and to other companies like me is is totally in their interests to make sure that they don't misuse the data, they keep a good reputation, and they keep my trust in them intact. Whereas that's not the case for a Google or for an OpenAI. They don't really care. Their interests do not align with mine, and I'm not that important to them, basically. Okay, so we just spoke about trusting a direct provider versus trusting a general provider. Now on to how can I pick the right direct provider that is trustworthy for me to trust them with my data. And it's a bunch of factors. First of all, as we said, we need to ask ourselves, is that provider accredited with something like ISO 27001 or some other accreditation and data safety standards? Have they had any known data breaches, obviously? Or are there any open lawsuits against them related to data handling? All these things are factors that we can use in order to pick a trustworthy provider. Right, and finally, this is a slide where we wanted to give a bit of an example that brings what we've spoken about so far all back together. And it's about an imaginary case where I'm looking for a solution and I have two options. Both options are direct providers, so this falls within the category of choosing a direct provider based on whether I can trust them or whether I can set out in a contract with them the safety guidelines that we've discussed. So let's say that I have two options. They both provide the same solution to me. One is what we call a proprietary model trainer. So that is a direct provider whose solution is powered by their own proprietary models that are trained on my data. And the other option is let's call them the ChatGPT wrapper, which is a provider that does not actually train their own models at all. And the way in which their solution is powered is that when I use them, I send my data, they send the data through to a third party like ChatGPT, an LLM, a powerful AI model. They get back the output or the solution and they send it back to me. So that's how their solution works. And in that sense, they're using external APIs, but they're not retaining my data and they're not training any models on my data. So we know already that the proprietary model trainer does have to retain my data in order to train the models, whereas the ChatGPT wrapper does not retain my data, but they do send them to OpenAI. And that means that the ChatGPT wrapper will have to send my data to a third-party API, which will then handle the data under their own terms and conditions, which in turn means that I, in a contract with them, cannot specify that the data needs to stay within their own premises. And I sort of lose control of my data a little bit because they're shared with a third-party provider, with a ChatGPT or whatever, who operates under their own terms and conditions. On the contrary, the proprietary model trainer, they do retain my data, which is perhaps not ideal, but I can draft a contract that makes sure that they only use my data in the way that I specify in my contract. And that is by keeping it strictly in-house, by only allowing non-generative models trained on my data to be shared outwardly, and by making sure that the access granted to those models is black box only. So any user of those models can only see the inputs and outputs of the models. And as we've discussed in our guidelines earlier, that really minimizes, that nullifies the risk of my data leaking into the wrong hands. So overall, I mean, obviously, in the end, the choice comes down to you, and there's other factors to take into account, like who is better other than data security. But from a data security perspective, I think it's fair to say that a proprietary model trainer that is constricted by carefully drafted contracts is a safer choice. And that's it. Thanks, everyone. We're happy to answer any questions if you have any. So I'm opening the chat here.
So there is a question on there.
Are there data privacy concerns even when dealing with privately hosted open source LLM models, especially when combined with APIs allowing web access? I think Alex knows this a bit better.
Yeah, I think it's probably worth clarifying what your definition of LLM is and whether it means generative models or just any machine learning models of a sufficient size. But as Jan talked about earlier, there's a real big difference between generative models and non-generative models. Okay, so LLM typically mean Gen AI, yeah. Because you can still prompt an LLM, even if it's got web access, you can still prompt it with your input and get the output. You can still potentially get data from the inside of it through web access. Whereas if you're talking about non-generative AI models, classification models and things like that, they can only output a constrained set of outputs, and so it's impossible to get the data that they were trained on out of it. Other data privacy concerns, even when dealing with privately hosted open source LLM models, especially when combined with APIs and LLMs. So it probably also depends on whether those privately hosted open source LLMs have been fine-tuned or not, or whether they're just off the shelf. Because off-the-shelf models could potentially leak any data that's been publicly trained on, or any data that they got access to train on it by whatever means they were, compared to a model that's open source that they've taken and fine-tuned on your data. I think there's quite a difference there as well. Curious how AI is available to decipher different layouts of SOVs or borderers. Does the AI go through an initial training period for each client?
Yeah, I can get that. So, I mean, that's the tricky part, and that's why it's often a good idea to use AI to solve this problem. That's why, like before AI, no one really had cracked this problem that well. But I think it comes down to the ability of AI to, first of all, it goes through, well, will it go through an initial training period for each client? It depends. You can choose to train specifically on specific client data, or if the client data is general enough that it falls into the more generic category, it may not be necessary to train on specific client data. But I think the idea is that even though there are different layouts and many different characteristics of the data within a client, but across different clients as well, there are also some general patterns. So the models that are trained on a wide enough training set will be able to generalize to these patterns, throw away any perhaps client-specific noise, and then provide a solution that is good enough for everyone. And again, because different clients might have different requirements or their data might look slightly different, there is an option always to either train your AI on specific client data or enhance it with extra heuristics that are more client specific. Heuristics, I mean just rules, hard-coded rules.
I would also just add in that, I think that was a great explanation, Ian. I would also just add in there, if that is a specific scrub question, then we don't retrain on client data for every new client we have. We have a solution that's generalizable to all SOVs and all bordereaux, and is able to understand the original formats of any SOV or any bordereau. And again, that's down to the AI and, as Ian said, the variety of original data that we've trained our models on. Any other questions?
But say that we've not got any at the moment. That doesn't mean that someone isn't typing away. So to give people a bit of a chance for their typing to catch up with it popping in the chat. I suppose it's just worth me saying that the slides will be there, and I can see there you've got a link to your website, so people will be able to contact you via that. And I suppose what I say quite a general question, if you were to, I suppose, offer anyone advice if they were at the beginning of their journey in terms of utilising AI with boardrooms, what would that advice be?
I think it would go back to one of the earlier slides we had, which was about my data starts with, it starts with me initially. So making sure that people, everyone in the company that handles the data is educated on security best practices. These do change over time as well. A concrete example of that would be the royal we used to advise that people use long, complicated passwords, right, with lots of random numbers and uppercase, lowercase, and all this. And that they change them often. The advice has actually changed quite a lot in the last years. So now they recommend passphrases, which is three or four words together. Because ultimately the length is what keeps them secure when people are trying to crack passwords. And if people don't have to change it often, they are also more likely to pick a better password. When you force people to change, they often just increment the number at the end or something like that. And so real good education in the company is the starting point, I would say. Make sure everyone's got secure passwords and secure, sane default settings on lots of different applications, using single sign-on and all that kind of fun stuff. And then from there, then you can start to think about, okay, we've got our own sort of house in order, try and get the data in as good a sort of place as you can in terms of like labeling it or classifying it, categorizing it. Because some people may think that you can just send a bunch of garbage to a language model and it'll kind of, quote unquote, just figure it out. The reality is they are getting better and better all the time, but they're still not quite there. And so the better order you can get your own data in, easier it will be when you're working either internally on the solution or externally with an external provider. And then I think it really comes down to the contracts, making sure that the people you're working with are going to be good stewards of your data, and then move forward from there. And then you start getting onto the fun bit of actually trying to solve the problem.
Awesome.
Thank you.
I can see we've got one more question as well, but just to quickly add to that as well, if as well, Alison, your question is about how, if you're at the start of your journey and you're considering how to actually solve the problem. So I agree with everything Alex said, especially from a security point of view. I think one thing that we have a lot of conversations with the clients who are at the start of their journey, and they're trying to decide whether to solve this internally or whether to go away and work with a third party to solve it. And I think that just boils down to whether or not you've got the resources and the time to go away and do that internally, or whether it makes more sense for your business model to actually just go away and find someone who specializes in exactly that.
Thank you. I think we've got two more questions.
No, I think the first one could be for me. So, does your model track new records added in bordereau, especially when dealing with rolling bordereau? So add the delegated side of our solution, which I mentioned at the start, will handle your premium and your claims bordereau. And if you are also using Scrub as the basically as a database as part of the solution, then yes, we are able to look back at your previously uploaded bordereau and provide a comparison and let you know where there's been changes on the newest bordereau, in addition to letting you know, for example, like where a bordereau might have been missed.
And the last question, I think, again, you might be best to answer this, Nicola. Like, what specific problems or processes we found we had to train more AI on versus what has been simpler?
Yeah, okay. I don't know, Alex might have something to add to this as well, but
or Alex.
I will start off by saying we were actually having a conversation with Syndicate the other day about this. And what we've realized from working with market for 5 years, and we realized this very quickly, was that everybody cleans data in a slightly different way, and everybody has a different interpretation a lot of the time of what the original data can mean. So especially when we're cleaning up SAVs, but also it applies to the bordereau process, that sort of the bordereau data as well, is we've built a very accurate, robust, underlying AI-driven solution, but then we've put layers of personalization on top of that per client. And that has been, it's been really important, because essentially I don't believe there is one solution that fits all for this. So part of what Alex and the sort of full stack team have done very, very well, and the ML team have also done very well, is how do you do that scalably? So that's been a big thing for us to crack over the last 5 years, and fortunately we have cracked it.
Yeah, the only thing I would add maybe is that errors tend to propagate through the workflow and through the system. So if you get something wrong early on, let's say like which row the header is in, or which column has the address in, or whatever it may be, that obviously propagates throughout the whole cleaning workflow. So that's something we've had to work really hard on, because the errors propagate. So we spent a lot of time focusing on that sort of first bit of the workflow, getting it really good. And I think one of the things we've done, one of the decisions we've made that aged quite well, like Nicola said, is the layers of personalization on top of a core layer, and also splitting up the problem into sub-problems, which I know may sound a bit contradictory to what I just said about errors propagating, but it does mean that if you find a weakness in any part of the workflow, you can address that specific area on its own, without needing to retrain or restart the whole process again. So we've had lots of challenges, made some good decisions, made some less good decisions, but we're really happy with how it's going.
Thank you. I'm just checking. I think we have answered all the questions. So just in case there is another one on the way, I'll do my thank yous, and it might be that we'll pop back to answer a question if one appears. So yeah, so I want to say yes, a big thank you to Nicola, Alex and Leon for their presentation and sharing their knowledge, answering and the questions. And so the recording will be available, and what I'll do is add in the questions on the recording, so that you can see what they appeared in the chat, to save just listening to the presenter read it back. So yeah, so if there aren't any questions, I think that does bring a conclusion to today's session, which was very, very informative, and hopefully gave an insight to those who are on their journey, and also an insight to those who are early on their journey, or just wanting to know a little bit more about what we can use AI for, and how we can use it in terms of our tasks that we do on an everyday basis in the bordereaux. So yeah, so thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who's attended.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.